When I was about 5 years old, there was this really beautiful incident involving my mom and dad. They were standing there and they were embracing. They had their arms around each other. They were kissing and looking in each other's eyes and laughing and smiling. And I was standing there, a bashful boy with my hands behind my back, and I was smiling and beaming up at them because it was just such a beautiful, golden moment. And my mother looked at me and she realized that I'd been standing there watching them, and she turned and she smiled at me, and then she turned to my father and said, "Oh, look, Richard, David's looking at us and he's embarrassed." And I felt my face flush, but it was okay. I really enjoyed that moment, being embarrassed. And I thought there would be many more moments like that between my mother and father. But it was the first and last time I ever saw anything like that. What happened shortly after that is my father began drinking very heavily. And he'd come home from work and he'd be drunk. And there'd be angry, ugly words between the two of them. And I remember trying to sleep at night. And I could hear them arguing down in the kitchen, down below. And I couldn't get to sleep, and every time I'd hear one of them insult the other one, it broke my heart. And then it got even worse. It escalated to violence, and my father began to beat my mother. And I would hear the thuds and the scuffling, and I would hear the contact of flesh upon flesh. And I remember my mother fighting back, both verbally and physically, but she was overwhelmed by my father's strength. And then I imagined her collapsing on the floor. I couldn't see it, but she would end up crying. And this went on night after night for many, many years. And one time, it was the worst I ever saw. It was during the day this time. And I was in the kitchen, and my father and mother were in the next room, and I couldn't see them, but I could hear everything was going on. And it followed the same pattern. And I began to hear slaps or punches and something that sounded like kicks, maybe. And my mother called out to me, said, "David!" And I ran into the room, and my father was trying to shove a red, delicious apple down my mother's throat. Now, even at the age of 5, I knew that if he succeeded, that he would kill her. My mother reached out towards me, imploring me to come and help. So I ran towards them, thinking, because my cause was so just, that I could somehow summon the strength to force my father away from my mother. But of course, he just brushed me aside so easily, contemptuously. He said, "Get out of here, David." But I didn't leave the room. I retreated. And I thought, my father's going to murder my mother right in front of me, and there's nothing I can do about it. But for some reason, finally he relented. And he dropped the apple on the floor and it rolled away. And then he left the room to go sleep at home. My mother again called out to me, and I went to her to try and help her to get up as best I could, and she was crying, and I cried bitter, bitter tears too. This went on for many years, time after time after time. So I resorted to petitioning and praying and prayer to God, or to the moon and the stars. I would go over to the windowsill, and I'd kneel by it, my hands on the seal, and I'd pray. And my prayers would go unanswered. I'd pray for my father to stop his drinking, to stop beating my mother. I'd pray for that golden moment again, but it never came. So in bitterness, I turned away from God and religion, and I became more and more hardened as the years went by. I became a very, very angry young man, and a very man later on. And I remember when I was walking down the street that I would see some altercations between men and women. And I intervened a couple of times, and I think I saved a couple of different women from being attacked or from being further attacked. But there was this one time in Cambridge some years ago, and it was this guy who was being very ugly with his woman friend. I don't know if they were husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, but he was using ugly words towards her. And I thought, I hope he puts his hands on her. Because if he does, I'm going to jump him, I'm going to take him down, I'm going to bash his fucking head against the pavement. And I thought, if Freudian were to see this, he would say, well, that's your father's head you're beating on the pavement or want to. And I would say, no kidding. You know what? I know it, but I still like it. Now, I realized that this was no way to go through the rest of my life. First in despair and chronic depression, then in anger. And I realized if I was going to change, though, I would have to tear away the scar tissue around my heart, layer by layer. So I proceeded to do that. And when I realized after years of doing this, that golden moment was never to be repeated between my parents, but it wasn't out there. It had been here all the time. And that I had not so nearly as far to reach as my mother did when she cried out to me for help. I only had to reach as far as my heart. Thank you.